our discussion is kind of in two-part. We have two speakers who are going to speak for about 45 minutes or so, including Q&A, 45 minutes to the next hour, who have the closest history to Whole House's theater history and theater program. And then we'll all meet in a panel discussion to really hash out some of the issues about theater in Chicago then and now. And we have a really powerful group this afternoon who are also connected to each other who are going to be part of that conversation. So the first person that we have speaking is someone that we drew on a lot in creating the Participatory Arts Crafting Social Change exhibition and the theater part. We made a huge error and oversight and forgot to include his bio in the program, so we have a special insert, so make sure you have it on this card. That's our next speaker. Dr. Stuart Hecht is an associate professor and was founding chair of theater at Boston College. He is editor of New England Theater Journal, an officer of the American Theater and Drama Society, and member of the New England Theater Conference's College of Fellows. He was on the artistic staffs of the Goodman and Wisdom Bridge theaters in Chicago, and his dramaturgical work there was subject of articles ranging from the Chicago Tribune to Yale's Theater. Hecht's book, Transposing Broadway, Jews' Assimilation, and the American Musical, gained recommended status from the journal Choice. It was later issued in paperback and formed the basis for the Peabody Award-winning PBS documentary, The Broadway Musical, A Jewish Legacy. Oh gosh, I'm missing the rest of it. He is currently writing a book on theater at Jane Addams Whole House Settlement in Chicago. Thank you. And has written chapters in several books on 20th century Jewish American theater. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stuart Hecht.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, and my thanks to Whole House Museum for including me. I'm honored and privileged. Oh, not allowed to use that word, am I? Shoot. Lucky, happy, appreciative to be here, and really thrilled by the kind of programming that's happening here. You know, when Whole House sort of disappeared and died, and was it 2012 officially? Yeah, as a Whole House Association, and it's just marvelous that this institution, the Whole House Museum, under this lady's leadership, is preserving the traditions and the openness and the dialogue and the inclusivity, and making it a living. I don't want to use the word museum. So thank you. But our job is to educate her about Chicago arts, and because she's from New York, you know. And the other part of it also is, I just want to say, is that sitting here the last 2 days has, I find personally, been transformative. I've learned so much from everybody here.
Here, here.
Right? The discussions, the information, the perspective, the worldview. And I'm going to be working on a book in the coming year on this stuff. But it's going to be a very different book, I think, now than it would have if you had asked me about this even like yesterday or the day before. And that's real. And isn't that thrilling, you know? Anyway, so I sat down and I actually wrote out like an article, and then I asked Jennifer about it, and she says, "Stuart, you can't read an article." Okay, I'll fake it. I will also do one more little self-promotion, and that is that in addition to working on the Whole House book, I'm working with two other young scholars on a book that's going to come out, I think, in the spring by Northwestern University Press. It's called Makeshift Chicago Stages. And it's sort of saying that there's a tradition here in Chicago of, over the past 100-some years, right, of doing theaters in unconventional locations. And that's really, I think, specific to Chicago. I mean, many more cities tend to say, oh, these are the theater structures in town, and therefore let's bring in this company, or it has to take this form. Chicago's always been improvised. And I think that impacts the aesthetics, and impacts sense of community, and I think it impacts also value systems that are reflected in the community. So it's really cool. Well, my last also is to Cheryl. I told her, and I have to say it officially too, thanks to her for writing Pots of Peace, because I came across this about 1.5 years ago, and it's just a fabulous book, and it's based on the exhibit that you guys did, you and Peg Strobel did. And I just recommend it to everybody. It's more than just simply a catalog and some nice pictures of pottery. It's really, really encapsulates, again, the values that are built into that and what this place is about. So you said at the end of your talk, you hope people read it, and I'm saying, yes, we are. Okay. Anyway, I figured that my job today probably should be to let you all know about Hull House Theater, which basically ended by about 1970. So I'm sort of stuck in the past. But I think it's important because it contextualizes what's going on now and the stuff that people are going to be doing later on today and so forth. So I'm going to give you all a bit of a history lesson. There'll be a pop quiz afterwards. I hope that you do all right. Otherwise, you're going to have to pay for your lunch. Let's see here. So, basic stuff. 1889, Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, right? They found Hull House. And they'd previously been looking around, trying to find places to help people, and they went to London and Toynbee Hall, the stuff that Ali talked about the other day. And then they came back to America, and they wanted to be in Chicago, and so on. And they deliberately chose a location, which is here, of course, which was at that time a mishmash of different ethnic enclaves. They were impoverished, they were tenements, and representing a broad range of different nationalities and different traditions and cultures, therefore, most of whom basically were not communicating with each other at all, most of whom essentially were isolated, and most of whom were barely surviving. When they opened the doors, they said they built the mansion was named after a guy named Charles Hull. Fun facts. He built the mansion, it was abandoned. They rented it, they renovated it, and they filled it with art. That's no doubt thanks to Ellen Gates Starr. And the idea was kind of uplift. And so when they opened the doors to the neighbors, they were saying, oh, come here and wander around, look at all the pretty artwork we've got on the walls and everything, and also listen to lectures and things like that. And basically a lot of the neighborhoods were suspicious. What's going on here? What do you people want of us? We just want to live our lives, and who are you upper middle class waspy ladies anyway? So that's kind of what's going on. But slowly it started to take shape. And I don't remember, was someone said that the first building built after the initial settlement was the Butler Art Museum?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and maybe the third or fourth building was a theater, a state-of-the-art theater. There were 13 buildings in total, so it wasn't just Hull House per se as a building, it was actually an entire campus block, full block. And they had resident staff, and that's really important because they were drawing people who likewise were sort of upper middle class, not rich, but were somewhere, but mostly self-supporting. And more women than men, but there were men here as well. And most of these people went on to becoming innovators in all sorts of fields. I mean, it's really an extraordinary group. Leading roles in health and education, child and adult labor laws, welfare, sociology, social work, and the arts. Some lived here, some came and just observed. That's important. They believed, and it goes back to Ruskin and Morris, William Morris, that art and doing art freed the spirit. And it goes back to pre-industrial, they believed in pre-industrial times, before machines took, isn't it? Weird thought, how come machines actually take over people's lives? I wonder. You know, when things were handmade, and there was a strong sense that there's a commonality in human experience and human expression, as well as valuing art as being individualized. As a result, actually, Morris is kind of funky because William Morris was creating art. He was rediscovering ways of doing things like they had been, like art, in ways that had been done like back in the Renaissance, but the arts and the crafts had long been lost. He rediscovered stuff. He's doing dyeing techniques, you know, and all that sort of stuff right now. Fascinating. But his clientele, because it was all handmade, meant it was really expensive, so it became chic, you know. And it was paradoxical because then Morris himself decided to become a socialist. And by socialist, I mean like he was a friend of like Karl Marx. And he was at all sorts of campaigns and everything in England, you know, sort of leading things. So on one hand, his clientele is rich and affluent, and on the other hand, his own politics become increasingly radicalized, which I kind of funky. And of course, his biggest fan really is Ellen Gates Starr. And that's also kind of funky and interesting. Anyway, they open the doors, they have theater. Theater, yes, because the way it worked was that residents were told that you could stay here and you had to pay rent, but you also were expected, I think it was to do contribute 2 evenings a week to leading and working with locals in whatever your area of interest is. And so different people would start different kinds of clubs and things like that, top down. And along comes a woman with one of the best names I've ever come across, Laura Dainty Pelham. Now the thing is, she wasn't dainty at all. One person described her as being as wide as she was tall. That's true. She had been a professional actress, and her husband ran a theater circuit. He died, Fred died, and she ends up moving into Hull House. But she had been a hard-nosed professional actress. And so she's, of course, going to start a theater company, isn't she? There was some stuff already here, and she sort of drew from the different individuals who seemed to be particularly serious about it, and so on. And she trains them in the latest acting techniques that she knows. This is about 1896, 97, 98 or so. She brings in Joseph Jefferson. Have you heard that name before in Chicago? Yeah, the real Joseph Jefferson, you know? Rip Van Winkle himself. He was a huge star of the American stage, and she brought him in, and he gave talks to them and trained them in some things they needed to think about if they wanted to be actors, you know, and so on. But she was very serious about it, and their work got better and better, and eventually, the Irish players came from Dublin about 1911 or 12, and they became friends, and they, you know, like they had lunches together, things like that. No, I mean, really, they did. They hung out together, the two groups, for a while. And as a result, the players ended up going to Ireland. You know, it's kind of funky. They later were referred to as the Irish players here, but they weren't. In fact, they were a mixture of all sorts of different nationalities, many of whom English wasn't their first language. They were locals. What's really interesting is that Addams herself said, you know, she writes about this, and she said that she would see how young people in the neighborhood here love to go and see melodramas. They go to the local theaters here, you know. And she said, you know, melodramas aren't good for people. These young people, part of the problem is that they have, I think she used the term shop worn or something like that, you know, dreams. That their images are all about escapists, where they're heroes or they're heroines, or they get married or whatever. You know, not actually addressing their actual concerns in lives, and therefore she saw it as being destructive. So she suggested, gee, why don't you guys do plays that actually deal with these kinds of social issues in its own terms, you know? So that because of her, this little group of immigrant actors, whatever you want to call them, start doing plays by Shaw and Ibsen and Chekhov and people like that, you know? And it's funky if you think of Galsworthy, because here you have a group of immigrants portraying plays set in, well, tenements, you know? And showing the injustices that tenement dwellers dealt with, because it's social realism, it's social justice plays, you know? But then Addams would bring in all her rich supporters, right? And say, look at the good job Hull House is doing. Look at how these former immigrants that you all were frightened of, right, actually can be like doing the latest avant-garde theater, which is what it was in the day, you know? And they say, oh yes, let's find out Hull House is doing a good job, you know? There's very, very complex stuff flying around here. But because of that, they by about 1900 and so, 1901, they're doing, again, these plays that nobody else in America really was doing. And that's why they ended up being regarded as the first little theater in America. It was already a big movement in Europe, but not in America. So that's kind of cool. And then it influenced a lot of other people doing theater in Chicago as well. So that's kind of Pelham. And the second group crops up, and that's started by a woman named Edith Denancreed. And Remus, in her forthcoming book, has this little section on Edith. And Edith Denancreed was the daughter of the professor of surgery at the University of Michigan and mainline Philadelphia money. very, very much upper crust. And in fact, later on when she was at Hull House, she dropped the DE between her names because she thought it was too highfalutin, you know? So she just became Edith Nancreed. But her background was with dance, really, and folk dance and things like that. And so she started working with kids, little kids. I'm saying 3 and 4 years old, and teaching them dances. And she had a group of 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds perform a production of Midsummer Night's Dream. There's a wonderful little quote from a newspaper saying that they actually, you know, oh, this is easy to memorize because it's actually all rhymes. You say, oh, you're a clever little child, you know, but true, absolutely true. And the kids adored her. And so then she started to form them into little clubs. Like one group's called like the Marionettes, and another's called like the Merry-Go-Round Club, another one's the Harlequins, these kind of cute kids' names, you know. And they start like they're 5 years old, and then after a couple of years, there's more kids come along, so she'll start another group, and there's more kids that come along, you know. And then it gets even funkier, because over the years, they start becoming adults, but they stay in the same groups. They're still friends, you know, and then they have their own kids, and then their kids become like starting small groups. I mean, this is really incestuous, you know. And they start having like generations of this stuff, and then they move to places like Winnetka or something, you know. But then they still have sending their kids here to do theater with Miss Nancreed, you know. And it's not just that; it's that then she also would have like assistants, because some of these kids would grow up, you know, or not. I'm saying their teens, and they become her assistants because they knew all the dances and everything, and there were too many kids. And she had hundreds of kids to actually teach them all at once. So she would say, okay, so-and-so, well, can you be my assistant? So this one becomes her assistant, you know? So she starts to train people this way, and it starts to proliferate out. And some of these people ended up making really sizable contributions nationally to children's theater and adult theater. One of them ended up being the head of the Federal Theater for Northern California after she was teaching at Yale for a while. So I mean, this tells you a lot about maybe Nancreed, I don't know, but certainly about the dynamic people that were growing up in this neighborhood, even though they were impoverished and so forth. So she's a pioneer of children's theater, but she loved this kind of escapist stuff, like I said, like Midsummer or Maeterlinck, this kind of dreamy kind of stuff. But you know, these are kids who are growing up in really drab lives. They're working, and you know, mom and dad can't afford to keep them in school. And therefore they have to get jobs, and they're working in factories, and very, very sober and very, very frightening lives, really. So this was just like a breath of fresh, literally a breath of fresh air, you know, a ray of sunshine, whatever you want to call it, and really kept with them. And these people remained friends literally the rest of their lives. And it's also fascinating is that when I looked at this stuff originally, it's like you can see the ethnic things. So here's this one club and all the names at play. And all the names are Irish, and here's another one, all the names are, I don't know, Jewish, and just the names are. And then what starts to happen, you can start to see it, is the names and the ethnicities start to mix. And then they become lifelong friends. And that's extraordinary too, because the neighborhoods were all isolated. So you can start to see how Hull House is serving this function to break down walls and build bridges. But that's a threat to a lot of people too, isn't it? So that's going on. The third era is that Hull House itself, and I'm going to get to that a little bit later on, but Hull House itself is sort of, after Jane Addams died, the arts sort of went down for a long time. And then in the 1960s, they brought, the Hull House, you know, was torn down to make way, Mayor Daley, to make way for the University of Illinois, Chicago campus, there you go, right? And Hull House became decentralized. And they brought in a guy named Paul Jansen, the director of Hull House, and he brought in his theater director, a guy named Bob Sickinger. And Bob built a program here between 1962 and 1970 that was the most exciting theater in the city of Chicago. Chicago was always a touring place. And all the theaters you see, today in Chicago, there's between 200 or 300 theater companies, right? That goes directly to Hull House. He was introducing Chicagoans to people like Pinter and Albee and Beckett and people like that. And his own creativity as a director was extraordinary. But he was a visionary, and he managed to get people so excited about theater. And you get people like, oh, I don't know, everybody from David Mamet, young teenage David Mamet, was kind of scary, I'm blanking, Jim Jacobs, who wrote Grease, for example, all they came through here, and stuff like that too. But more importantly, he built up an audience for avant-garde theater here. And that's how come you have a theater audience in Chicago for all sorts of interesting theater. So that comes back to Hull House again, too. Anyway, so that's happened. Back to Jane. Okay. Ellen K. Starr loved the arts. Theater not necessarily so much. It was Jane Addams who really loved theater, as I said before, and she's really pushing this stuff, and all the arts and so on. I think that what happened really is that because Jane Addams changed. She came in here and she originally was bent on uplift, upper middle class values, and get everybody to be thinking high-minded in terms of those traditional ways and Europeanized, right, you know? But then what starts to happen is, and unlike most people, she was remarkably open-minded. And she listened to the people around her. I mean, she's holding one person's baby in one arm, one kid's baby in the other, because she's helping. That's how personal she was with people. People knew her, they trusted her. She was really a member of the community. You cannot believe how personal and how important that was to the success of the place. But at the very same time, she's paying attention and she's open. And she's listening to different ways of thinking and being. This got her into trouble, though, because she started to become more and more sympathetic with people at different extreme points of view in the neighborhood. She started to sympathize with socialists and anarchists and people like that. So all of the wealthy people who were supporting her started to evaporate in their support, you know? And Addams herself, therefore, Hull's House is losing money. And then there's also a depression in the 1890s and so on. So she has to make money, so she starts to give lectures and then writes her famous books. And that's a way to build income. I think what's fascinating about it is that she does something I think is remarkable. And that is that on one hand, she's hands-on and she's really experiencing and paying attention to the world around her. And at the same time, she has a remarkable capacity to sort of step up outside herself and look at those experiences objectively and clinically. And she starts to describe, even though, you know, oh gee, yes, we're getting along, well, let me help you with that. But at the same time, she's saying, and this population seems to be doing this, and this seems to be an ongoing problem. And how can we solve this over here, you see? And I think that feeds, if you read like 20 years at Hull House and then 40 years at Hull House, remarkable books, she's really showing this capacity to understand and analyze and observe. You might as well say this place became a lab, and you might as well say that this is a place that became a source for field work. And as a result, a lot of people came who I think then subsequently followed her example. So people who come to Hull House, like, for example, John Dewey. John Dewey is here, he's observing the interactions, but he's all, just like Addams, he's studying the way in which people live their lives and learn things firsthand, and he starts to write about it based on this kind of firsthand experiential observing kind of way. And that's from Addams, you know? And he revolutionizes American education in the process. Harold Ickes comes in. Same thing, he's observing and so on. Who's Harold Ickes? Harold Ickes basically becomes the force behind the New Deal. And he's here, for example. You see? It's like, these are remarkable people, you know? And Addams herself, of course. So what happens is that, let's see here. So Addams is going, everything's going really, really well for the most part until World War I. When World War I comes along, I mean, Addams is the most popular woman in America in 1912. As a woman, she seconded the nomination at the Progressive Party for Theodore Roosevelt's nomination for president. And this is in an era when women didn't have the vote yet. But within a few years, in 1912, right? But within a few years, 5 years later, you have the America entry into World War I, and what happens is that she's a pacifist. And because she's a pacifist, she becomes increasingly despised. And she becomes increasingly isolated. Local church here literally marked her name off of the Bible because she was viewed as such a radical for her peace beliefs. Different to nowadays. So it starts to so she's suffering all this kind of attacks, you know. Then, after the war, Hull House suffers another hit because from starting about 1912 or so, you have the rise of nativism. Gee, that never happens in America. And you have the rise of nativism, and it hits a peak in 1924, was the biggest year for the Ku Klux Klan. And in 1924, the Klan actually came within a whisker of winning the national, the nomination for Democratic candidate for president. They lost. I mean, the Klan didn't win, but that close. And then what happens is then the Republicans win, that's Calvin Coolidge. And the very first thing they do is they institute a new law, which is the Immigration Act of 1924. And the Immigration Act of 1924 said, we're closing the doors. After millions of immigrants, we're closing the doors. And all of a sudden, and especially all those troublesome people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, which basically are the people who lived around here. So Hull House has impacted this because it had been spending 30 years, if you think about it, in the business of helping immigrants adjust to America, right? But all of a sudden, those doors are closed. So what happens in the neighborhood is instead, you get people who are, instead of Western Europeans, which they're so good at sort of processing and helping, the neighborhood becomes more and more Mexican, it becomes more and more African American, along with the Greeks and so forth. So that's a different population, which cannot be, what's the word, acculturated as easily, you know? And as a result, Hull House has a big challenge of how it's going to adjust and so on. After 25 years or so, in 1924 also, a woman comes to Hull House named Neva Boyd. And Neva Boyd was already been developing her thoughts, and Neva Boyd and processes and methods, and talking, and she was studying children, and she was saying children raised in industrial situations where they have to work all the time and there's no light or joy, deserve the right to play and have imagination and be silly, because that's necessary for their psychological and emotional development. So she's going to study children. She's really operating, though, in the footsteps of Edith and Anne Creek. Same stuff, working with kids, same stuff, teaching them dances and folk things and preliminary theater stuff. But her goals are different because she's not interested in theater per se. She's interested in studying how people do things. She's really an educator and a sociologist. And then she had, in 1924, a woman, an 18-year-old woman from Chicago comes here named, I think it was Viola Mills at that point?
Yeah.
Okay. And Viola Mills becomes Viola Sills, who then becomes Viola Spolin. And she's here for about 3 years, and then she becomes Boyd's assistant. And then she leaves. What basically happens after that is that Addams and everybody's getting older, that Hull House is becoming more and more questionable as to its effectiveness, that the world has become increasingly professionalized, that instead of residents who are volunteering their services and their time and living here, you now start to have professional social workers who are trained and believe only in 9 to 5. I'm here from 9 to 5, and my job is to fix problems. And the neighbors, those are problems. Not neighbors and people that I live with the residents always believed in, right? Suddenly things become pathologized. And that's really horrible, I think. Addams didn't like it, but it was still part of what came out of Hull House. So that's changing. Addams is, income tax things are changing. Addams is the big source of money. She dies. So Hull House is hitting a crisis by the late 30s. The funding is coming from the WPA. They bring in Charlotte Carr as the new director. Charlotte Carr was tough as nails woman. Nobody liked. And she also implemented, she had been like the assistant in New York City for welfare during the Depression under LaGuardia. So she was a tough administrator, you know. But Charlotte Carr, therefore, tries to make everybody fit into models. She sets up an arts committee, and the arts committee, under a guy named Jesse Ogden, they're going to do a play, and the play they're going to do is called Halsted Street, and he writes it with the group, but he really writes the script, and the committee is Viola Spolin, because she's come back to Hull House on WPA money. And they do this production, and it brings in everybody from the community, and it's performed, and it's showing this neighborhood right in the middle between the Depression and the start of the war. The Depression's behind them, the war's ahead of them. And it becomes a huge hit in the theater. The actors, hundreds of people in the cast. And we don't know to what degree Spolin contributed, probably a little here and there. She directed it, but it was just the Ogden's thing. The play's a huge hit, such a big hit, Carr says, let's do another one, but let's do it only so that art is only to fix things, because really, and then she cuts arts programming, because after all, those people would be better off just sort of like getting jobs. Oh, and by the way, all that ceramic program, the Mexican community here, let's cut that, because you know those people should just be getting jobs. See the divide between art and social work. Right? So what happens is that she alienates everybody, and in 1941, the staff, Ogden and Spolin included, quit. And in 1943, car was forced out. It's the difference between STEM and STEAM. It's the difference between art as part of an organic, holistic whole, and that it's part of human improvement, or is it only social work in the sense that people are just problems? Addams fought for holistic whole. So I know I've gone and talked way too much, but I have lots to say. Thank you very much.
Aretha Sills is the granddaughter of Viola Spolin, who was the originator of theater games and the author of Improvisation for the Theater. She studied Spolin Theater's games for many years with her father, Paul Sills, the creator and director of the Second City and Story Theater. And she has conducted workshops in Paul Sills' Wisconsin Theater Game Center, Bard College, Stella Adler Studios of Acting, Stockholm International School, Sarah Lawrence College, and Northwestern University. She has trained educators from the Second City, the Alan Aldrich Center for Communicating Studies, Communicating Science, Northwestern, DePaul University, Columbia College, and many other schools and universities. Aretha was a keynote speaker at the California Education Theater Association Conference. She's the Associate Director of the Spolin Theater Works, and she gives talks about the history of improvisational theater in the United States and how it emerged from the progressive era educational philosophies cultivated at Jane Addams' whole house. Please welcome Aretha Sills.
All right, so we're here to talk about, there's Viola as a young woman. So my father, Paul Sills, Ross told you who he was, he used to start his workshops by asking all the teachers to raise their hands. So teachers, where are you? Please raise your hands, all right? Most of us, we've got a big group here, and the rest of you, all right, yes, of anything. Like it didn't discriminate. Teachers of anything, it doesn't have to be professional. So then he'd tell a story about how his mother, Viola Spolin, this woman, found a true teacher, Neva Boyd, and how improvisational theater emerged out of that opportunity. And then he'd always thank the teachers for spreading the work, because for him that's what was going to save the world. So I'm here to tell that story today, and I apologize, I only have a little time, and these people are big people. But I'm gonna do my best to get as much of that, so I'm gonna leave a lot out, sorry. But of course, this is Hull House, so everything emerged out of a community of people, and we've gotta honor that. But really the story is about the ripple effect of education, you know, and so let's start by talking about this woman, Paul's teacher, his mother, Viola Spolin. There she is, this was her headshot from the 1930s when she went to New York to become an actress. But in case you're unfamiliar with her, I'll read you the very first words in her book, Improvisation for the Theater. Quote, "Everyone can act. Everyone can improvise. Anyone who wishes to can play in the theater and learn to become stage-worthy. We learn through experience and experiencing, and no one teaches anyone anything. Talent or lack of talent have little to do with it." So this experiential approach is, you know, still radical, sadly, but it's not new. It emerged out of the progressive education movement here at Hull House that Stuart talked about and some other people have talked about so eloquently, and I will. So luckily, I can, you know, you get the idea. So Viola was born here in Chicago in 1906 to a family of Russian Jewish immigrants. Oh, this way. There she is as a young woman. This was, she wrote it to Mama from Viola. She had 5 siblings and busy parents. And so she and her siblings played in the streets, in abandoned construction sites. They would like swing. She wrote about swinging from the equipment anywhere they could. She was an energetic, totally modern girl. Let me show you. This is her. She went to Lakeview High School in the 1920s, where she played basketball, wore red lipstick and men's clothes and bobbed hair. Her nickname was Spark, appropriately enough. But look at her. I love to show this to young people, especially because you think you're modern. Well, you know, I mean, history is complex, everyone. And there's this young woman. She's the picture says it all, doesn't it? Look at her. These are, she and her girlfriends would put on shows. There's some guys behind them in sailor pants. They're doing a little number there with banjo and cigarettes. This is she and her girlfriends. They all got together on an old Model T Ford, and they would run around up to Lake Geneva and whatever. And that's Viola with the rifle there, naturally. That's Viola. She told Jeff Sweet in an unpublished interview, "I don't know how I got through high school. I was so busy with basketball and baseball. I tried to get into drama class, but my grades weren't good enough and they wouldn't take me." But after high school, thank goodness, her sister Pauline took her to see Neva Boyd, who held classes in group work at Hull House at her recreational training school. We'd call group work social work today. Neva Boyd was an early theorist of the uses of play in education and social work, Stuart talked about. And Viola studied with Miss Boyd, as they called her, from 1924 when she was 18 until her first son Paul was born in 1927. And Viola said, quote, "Boyd taught group work, table games, arts and crafts, folk dancing, Kentucky running races. She traveled all over this country and Europe and brought back games and folk dances and taught them to us. Today I can still call a square dance." I don't think she's speaking when she's in her 70s. But I love that a Russian Jewish girl from Chicago can call a square dance. But she touched everything that was traditional and had the spirit of play in it, unquote. Later, Boyd joined the sociology department at Northwestern, and she's credited with innovations in the training of social workers, but she's not often given enough credit in the history of improvisational theater. Boyd wrote, "Play involves social values, as does no other behavior. The spirit of play develops adaptability, ethics, mental and emotional control, and imagination. They become habits of meeting situations happily." So like if you watch kids play, right? I mean, you know, they're going to argue over everything. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. They're going to argue over every aspect of the game. But if the adult stays out of it, they will work it out because they have a shared goal, and that's to keep playing, right? So, you know, it's built right in. Unfortunately, these days, I don't think we stay out of it enough. But, you know, sometimes you got to get in there. But, I see parents jumping right in. Now share and this and that. But are you helping kids, you know, learn to negotiate their differences and be a part of a community? Not so sure. So when Boyd writes social values, as she does there, I'm assuming she's in conversation with Jane Addams' idea of social ethics. You know, that idea that we need to get out of our own spheres, our own cultural, religious, economic, whatever they be spheres, meet people on common ground and get to know what they need. Boyd said play does this, right? So after training with Neva Boyd, Viola worked with recent immigrants, with orphans, church groups, and lots of kids. I found an old resume of hers. And she described one job as folk dancing and group therapy for working girls. That's all she said. I'll leave it at that. But I like the folk dancing. They're always folk dancing, right? But from childhood, Viola was drawn to the theater. She said, quote, "My father was a Chicago policeman. He was on opera detail. He took us to the opera all the time, and I fell in love with it, especially when it snowed on stage, La Boheme. That was pretty exciting theater for a kid to see. And I was a super once in Boris Godunov with Charlie Oppen. I did my first play when I was 10 years old, wrote, produced, costumed. For admission, I charged a penny or 10 pins. I don't know how I came up with 10 pins. Certainly a penny would have been more useful." And she came from a big extended family who got together and sang songs, played charades, and put on shows. Quote, "Every Sunday we'd take the streetcar and meet at somebody's house. Nobody had babysitters. They always sang, they always danced, and they would make up the funniest operas. I remember I had a friend, a very proper English girl. She came with one time and said to me, 'I didn't know people did things like this in their house.'" So there was her brother George, who would later become a state senator, described a family gathering for which Viola and her siblings and cousins wrote and performed a 3-act play about their aunts and uncles' escape from Russia. And they had costumes and sound effects like rumbling sheets of tin to, evoke the dangers they were escaping from. But it all ended happily in a double wedding in Chicago. And then afterwards, they improvised scenes of the family life, and he was writing it to another family member, and he singled out Viola, got for her hilarious impersonations of aunts and uncles. So she was they were already improvising, right? So in the 30s, Viola majored in dramatics at DePaul's night school. Did I miss it? Oh, I skipped past. This is Neva Boyd, by the way. I think I just skipped. Oh, there it is. We got Neva Boyd for a second. Sorry, I have another picture of her to show later. Here, she had a little clipping in her that she saved all that time. Viola has a noted role. And she studied at the Goodman Theatre. And with the group theater in New York, believe it or not, Viola studied the method. She acted and worked as a stage manager. She absorbed knowledge about the theater in every way possible that a recently divorced single mother could, really. I mean, so naturally, she began to teach dramatics, working mostly with recent immigrants with limited English skills and with children. And so lectures and traditional theater training were not helpful to her in imparting what she needed to impart, but she knew from working with Neva Boyd that play solved those problems. So every time that she had something she needed to communicate to her players rather than lecture them, she would create a game. And what they needed to learn about communication in the theater was embedded within the game. It became a focus of the game. And so the players learned through experience, through playing, and which allowed their natural ebullience in life and to be there. Everything an actor needs, instead of tamping it down, there it was because they were playing, right? But not only that, play is a true play. When one is focused, is kind of a state of liberation, right? Because all the cultural trappings, the stuff your parents told you not to do, your neighborhood told you not to do, it lifts off you, Viola says, right? You're free. And so in that state, anything can happen, and people were rearranged. And so, as Viola says, through spontaneity, we are reformed into ourselves. So eventually, she'd go on to create hundreds of these games because she had a lot of problems to solve, and they're problem-solving games. Through them, we solve problems. And they amount to a complete actor training method and a non-authoritarian teaching method. She called her teaching method non-verbal, non-psychological, and non-authoritarian, right? Because if you want people to be free, you're not going to then start critiquing them. You just ask, did you stay on focus? Did you not? And I ask a lot of teachers to revisit this. It's still fairly radical and helpful. So in the late 30s, Neva Boyd recommended Viola to the WPA to be a drama supervisor, and Viola rented space at Hull House, so she came back to Hull House. And she'd sometimes have to round up kids to play, trying to get them involved in her program. She said, I remember trying to get boys to join the group. I don't want to, they said. I want to play Hi-Ho Silver. So come and play Hi-Ho Silver on the stage, she said. So they came in and they played Hi-Ho Silver till I was about to die. Then they gave it up and worked. So she got them through play, right? So true to her original training as a social worker, her theater games have gone on to be used in countless fields and curriculums besides acting, psychology, English, religion, mental health, to help doctors and scientists communicate, and on and on. So I got to move. I've got 3 minutes to talk about Paul Sills. Good Lord, we can do this. All right. So she had a son. Her firstborn was named Paul Sills, and thanks to her, Paul was born into the theater. Here she is. This is. These got a little out of order, but we'll make it work. This is actually. Let's see, where is it? Oh, did that fit? Wonderful picture. Well, we'll find it. It's out of order somewhere. So Viola would invite all her girlfriends over to the apartment for game nights and prop Paul up on the bed because they couldn't afford babysitters, like she said. She once said, I think that's where Second City began. People used to say, you guys ought to rent a theater, because they were so hilarious. I think Paul absorbed a lot of that as an infant on the bed, right? This is why we got to involve our kids in what we do. So he went on to become the founding director of Playwrights Theater at University of Chicago with Ed Asner, Mike Nichols, he goes on, and many more wonderful players. Elaine May. He co-founded Compass with David Shepard, which is considered the first improvisational theater company. But this is a picture of Paul. This is Viola directing young players on the Hull House stage. And Paul is in the center with that script and the short pants, or emoting. And Viola directing them. I love, this is a beautiful piece of history right here, and how things are, you know, that ripple effect, right? Let's see, what do we have next? Oh, and this is also, let's see, this is going back to Viola had, this is a show she did at Hull House. And it's from 1940. It says, organized recreation for children takes many forms. Some more unique, none more unique than what is being done at Hull House. And so she had children improvising about air raids. They have coming to collect the rent. Today's news is tomorrow's play. Here, 11-year-old Leonard Kerfman reacts as he imagined anyone would in an air raid. That's up at the top. The boys, oh, no. And then they talk down here, when the villain comes to collect the mortgage on the old homestead, Grandpa Vincent Lombardo, 12, and Jeanette Catapano, 11, just stepped up and bopped him one. There we go, and he's complaining that they make do without proper costuming. But that looks pretty good for an improvised show. We don't. Oh, here's the picture. Somehow my pictures got out of order. This is Paul Sills on Neva Boyd's lap, drinking, the mother's milk of play. There. Isn't that an amazing photo? That this photo even exists. I just find it's incredible to me. And you can see how terrifying Paul could be, even as an infant. Look at that gaze. He's already creating a show. How formidable, I should say. So I don't have time. I'm gonna, Paul will, back to the Compass. I just want to read you a few more words about Paul. In 1955, after he founded Compass, he was interviewed, and he said, "Compass, if carried to its logical conclusion, is a sort of do-it-yourself movement. I'd like to see neighborhoods all over the city form groups like this. It's a search for a community." Now, talk about a boy who was educated at Hull House, right? In 1959, he co-founded the Second City, and as its founding director, he provided the artistic vision for the theater while he was there. And here he is. This is him in the 50s. I just found out this picture was taken by Martin Shapiro. Lucky Strikes and Shakespeare, if you zoom in. Here he is at Second City, smoking again. He quit before I knew him, but he certainly liked to pose with. But that is a nice picture. Again, Martin Shapiro. This picture has Paul and the producer Bernie Solins in the front, but I like this one because Viola is in the back there on the left, which is rare to see them both. My mother, too, is in that one. Severn Darden, lots of wonderful players, future lawyers. Here's the, I have about, how much more time do I have? We want to do a game, right? Do you want to do a little game? All right, so should I stop here? All right, so I'm going to stop here. Went over a little bit. It's just too much what these guys did. So what I wanted to get into a little bit was about Paul leaving Second City. And when he left Second City, it was in response to the Civil Rights Movement and the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, and then later in '68, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, and how he wanted to find a way for theater to respond to those times. And again, he returned to, it was a big question, or how could, he didn't even think, deign to think that he could, but that if theater could. And what he did was he returned to fairy tales, which came from Neva Boyd to Viola. And he said this, and I'll just leave you with that. I'm going to find the quote, and I'll leave you with that. "I am a son of Viola Spolin. So I was in some of her theater game workshops at Hull House, Chicago. It was her influence which led me to read book after book of fairy tales from many cultures. Since she was the student of Neva Boyd, who taught traditional games and folk dances at her recreational training school, I came in for a lot of playing. All of this has stood me in good stead on my journey. So Paul and Viola both believed that Hull House was a huge, part of their theater, and I like to, leave everyone with Viola's. I'll leave you with this. This was I was going to talk about game theater, story theater. There's Paul directing story theater. I'll leave you with this image of Viola. Viola said, "Play is democratic," and I will leave you with that thought. And thank you all. And we have. How much time do we have to play? 10? All right, cool. All right, so we would like to play one of Viola's theater games. Anyone who would like to participate is welcome. The game is called Mirror. This is one of her most probably utilized exercises. You need to partner up, maybe turn to the person next to you or find a pair. We've got two people. And when you find a partner, decide who would like to initiate the movements, gentle flowing movements, and who would like to reflect the other player from head to toe, including facial expressions. Willa needs a partner here. So you can do this, come standing in the aisle or seated, whatever you like. Whatever's good for you.
What is our range?
Whatever you decide, whatever your initiator decides. All right, so when you get together with your partner, does everybody have a partner?
No, I think.
All right, so when everybody has a partner, the initiator will begin making flowing movements, big full body movements, taking enough time to help your mirror. And mirror, you will reflect the other player from head to toe. That's your focus, including facial expressions. That's right, and don't take too long on deciding, because guess what? It doesn't matter. All right, so, and now I'm going to have to ask you to play the game silently because we'll all be listening to one side coach. That's me. So I'm the side coach. The side coach is the fellow player, says Viola. So that's right, eyes reflect eyes, and fingertips reflect at the same moment. Hips reflect hips. Reflect only what you think you see, not what you see. No. Only what you see, not what you think you see. Excuse me, I'm talking too much. Toes reflect toes, head to toe mirror. And all focus is on reflecting, not wondering how to do it. If you start worrying about how to do it, just bring your focus back to reflecting. And initiators help your mirror by getting into a flow of movement so they can reflect you at the same moment. And now with no stop in the flow of motion, change initiators. So whoever was the first initiator, now you're the mirror. You don't need to stop, you just keep right on going. There you go. Chests reflect chests. And nostrils reflect knees, head to toe mirror, full body mirror. Now change initiators again. There you go, ears reflect ears, hair reflects. Elbows reflect elbows, full body mirror. At the same moment, reflect. Now change initiators again. And if you've lost track, you can check in with each other. just say, are you in the mirror? Are you in the mirror? There you go. You guys don't look like you've lost track. That's right. Eyelashes reflect eyelashes. Fingertips reflect. Full body mirror. Head to toe mirror. Change initiators again. And whatever you're doing, just always be making sure to protect your own body, but up the energy level up as much as is comfortable for you. Protecting your own body is always the most important thing. That's right. Just get it into motion a little bit at whatever level is comfortable for you. Your focus is on exact mirror reflection of your partner's movement. Now change initiators again. Now change initiators again. Now follow the follower. You're both the mirror now. You're both reflecting the other. Follow the follower. Eyes reflect eyes. Hands reflect hands. Hips and stomachs reflect. No initiating, only following. Follow the follower. Teeth reflect teeth. And eyelashes reflect. Knuckles reflect knuckles. Head to toe mirror. Full body mirror. Breathing reflects breathing. Follow the follower. All right, time to stop, wrap it up. Yeah. All right, so whenever you're ready, you can take your seat. Take your seat. Thank you, brave players. Thank you. You didn't know you were going to be roped into that, but I would like to say we normally do an evaluation after that, but we don't have time. So I just want to leave you with one last thought. That follow the follower is the true improvisational state where neither is initiating but both are reflecting, and what emerges between the players in the space came from the both of you, right? Did anyone get a moment of that? Did you catch a little moment of it? Ross and Sadi? Oh, right. Okay, great. Thank you. And that is the same as how Hull House affected the immigrants and the immigrants affected Hull House. That's follow the follower, people. All right.
Thank you, Stuart and Aretha. I hope that got some of the juices flowing. It looked beautiful to watch, and we got some great photos. So we are moving into the next part of the discussion, panel discussion, and you'll have a chance to also direct questions to our two speakers you just heard. Oh, if anyone is leaving before that, could you please see Ellen and pick up evaluation? The more feedback we have, the better. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce our moderator, our recently former colleague here at UIC. I won't say lost, that we lost you because you're here, you're found, and that someone else is benefiting. You know. Lori Barcliff Baptista is the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Programs in Advising and Senior Lecturer in the Department of Performance Studies at Northwestern University. Her portfolio includes the School of Communication Office of Undergraduate Programs, Student Resource Center, and Academic Advisors. She researches how members of marginalized communities attempt to make sense of and negotiate their places in the world through seemingly mundane everyday objects, and teaches courses that explore food as a performance medium, the analysis and performance of literature, performance theory, performance ethnography, participatory action research methods, pedagogy, social art practices, curation, and spectatorship. Her most recent project, Afrogeographies, is the product of a number of academic and creative collaborations that show and tell how Black cultural identity is constantly formed and reformed by individuals who attempt to reconcile their encounters with often conflicting histories, sources, experiences, encounters, traditions, illusions, and desires. Upcoming projects include Being Useful, Participatory Action Research, Placemaking, and Social Practice, which offers an assessment of several Chicago area community-curated arts projects, and Pedagogy Fails, a collaborative project which explores the pedagogical value of moments of embodied tension, conflict, and the revolt of the theater and performance studies classroom. Lori Baptista.
So I'm going to invite our panel up, and I think in the effort to continue to promote dialogue, I will fold their introductions into a part of our questions. And so I will, though, indulge by sharing our common genealogy and relationship and how we all know each other in the spirit of this gathering, which is really thinking about not so much object-focused work in a museum context, but rather process-driven work, and what that means in participatory arts. And so Coya Paz, who I have had the pleasure of knowing perhaps since maybe 2003 or 4, who I first encountered in a participatory way in a critique that she engaged others in rethinking representation and identity in West Side Story many months ago, which we might get to. Christine Mary Dunford, who also I've had the pleasure of knowing for as many years, who maybe later engaged in other ways in participatory action research in Chicago's diverse communities as a result of a project through the Field Museum using creative methods of engagement. And Willa Taylor, who I feel like I've known just as long in many different ways, so I won't attribute a false story of origin, but thinking very intentionally about a project that we did here some years ago to commemorate an anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and thinking about the involvement of African Americans in the military, and also using that opportunity to stage some intergenerational dialogues and intercultural dialogues with veterans in the hope of serving as an ally to student veterans who were organizing at the time for representation. And again, thinking of all of these different ways of knowing, but memory being embodied in a way of knowing, history being contentious and challenged, and the archive not being stable as the point where we began. So thinking about Stuart and Aretha's comments and thinking about history and context, particularly of Viola Spolin's work, but certainly why theater was so important at Hull House, I want to open with the question and start with Willa to think about engagement and participation in collective work. And especially, what does engagement mean in the theater? And thinking of you in your role, having had many roles, but certainly at the Goodman presently, and thinking about your relationship with youth and other marginalized communities, thinking about the importance of action and participation. What difference does it make to work with communities in creating theater work?
Thank you for that question. And I want to thank Stuart and Aretha for their work and their words before us. I think that my role as the director of engagement at a large institution is really twofold. Is strictly in the role as director, my job is to make the doors of the institution open to anyone and everyone, and to move the institution outside of its locus, move it out away from, in my case, the center of downtown, out away from its mission as a producing house, away from the idea that it is a large white old cultural institution, and into new ways of thinking, new ways of knowing, new ways of being. As a practitioner, I feel that story is the way that we learn not only about our relationship to the world, but how the world works. And theater is just a grand form of that storytelling. And if we think about individual moments of story, if we think about sort of the legacy of the Hull House and what it meant to sort of engage immigrants, to engage people in their community to tell their authentic stories, to me, that's what the job of theater actually is, to allow the truth of the narratives of our lives to be told, of all of our lives, and not just the single narratives that we often hear so much.
So I'm going to reframe it slightly for Coya and Christine, and then come back to Aretha. Coya, I wonder if you could speak from the point of view of Free Street in particular, and what that means to be to engage that community, not necessarily as spectators, but as collaborators who are creating work. And Christine, I'll ask you a version of the same thing from your point of view at Looking Glass as well.
So I teach full-time at DePaul and was so happy to hear that Viola Spolin is an alum. And I will be talking to our alumni people about that. I also have the great pleasure of being the artistic director at the historic Free Street Theater, which has been making theater by, for, about, with, and in Chicago's diverse communities since 1969. We were founded in the wake of the 1968 riots. The city actually invested quite a lot of money into the early Free Street Theater, thinking like, you know what solves racial and economic tension in Chicago? Free Street Theater. That sounds about right. We know today that that's not true, but we maintain a commitment to thinking about the ways that performance and live space can be used to challenge racial and economic segregation. We know that this is probably the deepest problem facing Chicago, is how deeply segregated it is in a way that allocates resources really inequitably. We say a lot at Free Street in our current incarnation. Free Street, like any historic institution that's been around for so many decades, really could be talked about as a lot of different institutions who just still exist under the same name or continue to exist. We talk a lot about joy and justice being the twin pillars of our work. We are interested in questions of self-representation. We don't want to make plays about an issue. We want to create spaces where we help facilitate people uplifting the stories and narratives and versions of their communities that are important to them. I think that's a very different project than deciding what stories need to be told about our city from an outside perspective, maybe doing some interviews and then casting actors to play those parts. That's exactly what we don't do. Often the play takes a very different shape than I thought it would. We are really deeply committed to social justice, but one of the reasons I teared up during Aretha, during your presentation, because people ask us all the time, like, oh, you must be drawing on Boab, right? You're basically theater of the oppressed, and I say no. To me, Chicago has this rich history of starting here at Hull House, of using theater and performance and play and joy to address really serious social issues. And I think that everything is a product of its time, both those early movements and also even early Free Street and current Free Street. But I always draw our legacy to here, not to other practices. I think in Chicago we're so lucky, we don't have to look very far to find a really passionate movement for using theater and performance to build bridges.
Christine, I wanted to kind of build on this idea of Chicago also having a very particular ensemble tradition and what that looks like. And I'm wondering if you could speak from your point of view from Looking Glass in terms of this idea of community and ensemble, and how does perhaps ensemble work, or the ensemble tradition of working in a collective in this way, have a particular resonance in relationship to some of the things that we've been thinking about?
Looking Glass has been around since 1988, 1989. We're an ensemble theater company. We were all students at Northwestern together. Initially, we were all white. Lots of different classes. But the way we started is that people had a common need to work on telling stories. And I think there's a thing that we've said over all the years, it's the story, it's all about the story. And what we've always looked for is stories that we can't go to sleep at night because we're dwelling on that story. And there's some truth in that story, or some problem in that story, there's something in that story, often we can't even identify what it is in the beginning, that's haunting us. And so, we think about engaging community and ensemble. We became an ensemble because, and we improvised everything. We talk about found spaces. We were itinerant for, I think 17 years or something like that. And we made every place we could into a theater, into a performance space, and we made everything up as we went along. And it was very improvisational. And we really, we did everything. The actors did the costumes, did this design, did everything for many years, and then we professionalized, like a lot of people do. And we're a very different company today, but and we've expanded, and our company is much more diverse in every possible way. And that was an organic expansion because we got to know people very slowly over time. But we're extremely committed to each other, and when we think about ensemble members, we think about, is this somebody that you want to be married to? So is this somebody that you want to argue with in the room? Is there somebody that you really want to argue with because their point of view is important to you? And you have to come back again, and you're promising, and you say yes to come back again and again to work with those people. So when I think about, and then we also Looking Glass, I was a founding teaching artist with CAPE, which a lot of these people are creating integrated arts education programs. And I think that there are multiple ways to think about community. And many different ways of thinking about community. It's very, very important, and we need to nurture lots of different kinds of community and community engagement in order to have a robust and holistic arts city. So we have to engage, support companies as companies, and then we have to have those companies do the work of making their work, but then also always looking out, always questioning, like Will is doing at Goodman, and like so many, and Coya is doing, asking what is our responsibility and how can we take what we know and bring it to other spaces and be with people in other spaces and learn back from them and stretch our ways of knowing and making. Kind of rambled, but engagement is really expansive, community is really expansive to me, and I think that we have to, I think of multiple circles of different kinds of community.
So I think this is a good transition to maybe speak really explicitly about pedagogy and teaching and different ways of teaching and learning through the body. And I think Aretha, I really appreciate that we had time for you to be able to take us through an exercise, because then it removes the work from an intellectualized version of this is what it did and lands it in the body, so that you can actually feel and see how this experience changes and becomes play. So I wonder if we can all take a pass, and I'll start with Willa and then kind of come around in circle to think about how these ways of teaching and learning in theater operate in some of your work. And Coya and Christine, I'll ask you to switch roles, not that they're separate things, but really then speak, and Stuart, you as well, from your role in the academy as a professor, as a teacher, and how that plays out. How does theater work in some of maybe the arts education models that you embrace?
So that really is the bulk of my work. I am actually leaving here to work with about 30 Chicago public high school teachers, using theater, using Spolin, using games, to get them to understand and rethink how they think about teaching. To get them to think about teaching as a liberatory act, of education as a practice of freedom, as opposed to education as a banking system that gives somebody what you think they need to know. And that is done through theater. It is done through the lens of the art that is on our stages, but in particular, it's done through getting them to understand themselves in a very different way. When we talk about sort of embodying knowledge, I think one of the things that often gets lost in that is the body part. And a lot of what we do is try to help teachers who are trained to impart information, to really understand that education is a dialogical model. And that as much as if you are doing what you should be doing, you are learning as much as you are imparting. And one of the ways that we can do that is by opening ourselves physically, opening the body, learning through the body, understanding that not all of us learn by looking at slides or listening to lecture or even dancing, that you need to sort of practice an array of those things to give students an opportunity to really fully engage with the work that you're doing.
Thank you. One of the things I think about a lot is that I teach at a conservatory, which is different even than teaching in other kinds of theater departments or schools. You know, it's very much about the training. A lot of it's very top-down. But my practice is not that, you know, I'm really committed to co-creation and to non-hierarchical ways of learning and being together. And so like figuring out how to bring that into the classroom where I'm expected to train my students into a particular discipline of like the American regional theater. It's so specific what a conservatory wants its students to be able to do. And that's not at all my practice. But I try as much as possible to subvert that. You know, all of my classes are co-designed. I don't give my students a reading list. I let them pick everything that they want to read. And in doing that, we have, you know, I love what you're saying. This is someone you want to argue with. We spend the first 2 weeks of class arguing deeply about what matters right now to read, what kinds of traditions we want to uphold. I'm trained, I mean, we know each other, many of us here from our work at Northwestern, our grad program, and I'm trained as a performance historiographer. I know that every history is a version of someone's version of history. It's not the whole story of what happened. And I really want my students to understand that everything we learn is a decision that leaves out other things we could learn. And that often these stories are incomplete. You know, even when we were doing the mirroring exercise, I was commenting to a friend of mine who is here, you know, I think every theater camp, school in the world probably does mirroring exercise now, and I have never heard anyone attribute it to Viola Spolin, though she very clearly talks about it in her written word, you know, and so I think so often what happens is that we normalize practices and we stop looking at where they come from in a way that's a profound act of erasure, and I don't want my students doing that, and I also don't want my theater practice doing that. You know, that one of the challenges in making work as a collective and in community with people who are not necessarily like theater stars or even theater quote-unquote professionals, that's for a different panel, what we mean by professional, I think, is that suddenly, you know, so often people want to give the credit to me, you know, like somehow, you know, oh, Coya is the doctor and the professional theater artist, so she clearly shepherded these people. And I think we also have to challenge that thinking too, that we aren't all coming with like sort of our magical and beautiful skills, and that our job together is to figure out the best way to create that for each other right now, whether it's in the academy or not.
So I think I've forgotten the question, really. It's about pedagogy?
I think that I probably didn't answer.
No, you did. You sent me off in a really a cool direction that I kind of want to go in now, but I want to go back to pedagogy. So, you know, I'm getting older, we're getting older, and I realized that all of my thinking and work has started to circle around certain ideas and certain questions, and or in my teaching work, and I got this from Viola Spolin, from Paul, from all the people who then influenced the people at Northwestern, who influenced us, and deep at my core about understanding why making my art is important and why theater is important is I know the importance of making. The importance of making kind of anything as a way to explore what it means to make meaning out of being in the world. And the way of making that I have ended up in is making stories. And so I make stories with other people a lot in different ways. And what I teach my students, what it's come down to in its essence, is that I don't teach a product. I'm in a place right now that's half conservatory and half sort of liberal arts here at UIC. We have a BFA, but we also have BAs. And And what I'm teaching people is, and I figured this out teaching at Roosevelt Fast Track with high school teachers from across the nation. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what I teach. I use the process of adapting anything into a performance text as a means to teach teachers or teach students how to teach themselves. And it's a process of critical engagement. It's a process of rabid curiosity and problem solving. I taught a class at Northwestern, presentational aesthetics, and we'd have sports people and economics majors in it. And this guy came up to me, a football player, and said, "What is acting?" And I was in a hurry, and I said, "It's problem solving with your whole self." And that's kind of what pedagogically, making theater is for me. And it is about democracy, and it is about civic engagement, and it is about working out the questions that are the most haunting at the moment. And that's what I think pedagogically is my job that I have taken on with my students. And that manifests itself most often, and I teach this class, I hate the title, but called Page to Stage, because it's not just page to stage. It could be painting to stage. It could be found a scrap on the L to stage. It could be something overheard to stage. But it's turning anything, adapting it, re-embodying it, putting myself or the students in conversation with it, and then putting it on with other people, for other people, in space and time.
Aretha, I think for you, part of what strikes me is you have kind of a dual pedagogical role, and one of it is kind of sharing another version of a history that is in many ways maybe erased or covered over that people aren't aware of, and then also sharing the product of what that work was. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see your role as a teacher in these ways, as well as particularly how it relates to a personal family history as well that you're sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Coya brought up, that everyone does mirror, right? Very often they leave out the follower part, but everyone does mirror, and they don't often attribute it to Viola's. And then improv in Chicago, took a different direction, right? From Viola and Paul's work after they left. And so I felt that my job these days is to just bring everybody back and remind them what Spolin Sills improvisation is, because it's different and it does different things, and it literally emerged out of teaching, right? And so if people come to me now after being trained in these other forms of improv, but they want a grant or they want to teach, or they suddenly have discovered, wow, there's improv for everything now. And I'm like, Viola and Eva Boyd would be like, of course there is. Where do you think it came from? But I find myself in a position of having to, sort of educate people about this whole history. So every single class I begin, I actually spend 15 whole minutes, and I have to tell them who Jane Addams was, because I don't always teach in Chicago either, and what Hull House was. And from there, then Eva Boyd, then Viola, then Paul. I mean, I taught at a guest class at a very well-known conservatory recently, and none of the students had even heard of Mike Nichols, who had, he'd had Broadway shows on, just a few years before that. So it was like, I've got a heavy load to do before we get in. But I feel that this is a very important story to tell right now. And this may sound simplistic, but it's because Viola was the child of immigrants who was transformed by education, and in that way she brought about this huge transformation of the culture, because it came from her family tradition and from herself and from her unique self that you saw in those pictures, from who she was meeting a great educator. And when we give up that responsibility of I think Jane Addams said, the creative power in the people themselves will only come out if it's given a chance. And when we give up that responsibility to educating all children in the full, capacity of with the arts and everything, we are denying not just them, but our whole culture the capacity for this kind of transformation to occur. And that's why I feel I tell this story, because ultimately I want every one of my students to go out and be a teacher. I don't care if they're an actor. Most actors become teachers anyway, right? But if you go out and teach, then there's a possibility for this again, and we need that now. So that's why I feel a sense of urgency in talking about that history now, not just like, oh, I need to keep the family legacy going, but that we need help, and that the culture needs this.
Stuart, I'm recalling, one of the calls that we were on, and we were talking through different approaches, and you speaking kind of as the voice of the historian in this way, giving us a longer window and context. I wonder how you imagine your own work too as a teacher, kind of being vested with these, contested or multi-layered or kind of complicated and overlapping histories and points of view, and how you approach that in thinking about theater history in particular.
Oh, God. Am I supposed to talk in the microphone?
If you can.
Oh, thank you. Do you mind? Can I actually take it? Is that okay,
This is
guys?
as far as it'll go.
That's okay. Okay.
Oh, here, come on in.
Okay. Hello again. Wow. That's a big question. I'm an artist and I'm also a scholar. I'm an editor and I'm an administrator. When I went to Northwestern, the story, I actually interviewed first at Carnegie Mellon, and in the interview, everything I said was wrong. And I thought, oh my God, I'm horrible and I'm never going to be able to do this. And then when I interviewed at Northwestern, everything I said was right. And that's because they're different values. Because Northwestern is more about content and context. And I thought, oh, they speak a similar language, how wonderful. And then when I was at Northwestern, I triple majored. I majored in, I took everything in directing and in dramatic literature and in theater history, because I was just in that thing called the theater department across the hall. But I also worked with like Galati and people like that. And I also started to, I decided to work on, I was at the Goodman, and I found out about Hull House. I said, oh my God, my grandmother took classes at Hull House. She talked about Carl Sandburg on the step playing the guitar and singing his poems. I said, wow, that's fantastic. The point is that I suddenly had to learn well about sociology, didn't I? And urban history. And Northwestern is wonderful, at least at that time, I don't know what it is now, because it had the flexibility and openness. And it was interdisciplinary, really, And I still do that. And I don't know why my crazy brain works this way, it just does, To me, it's not about discipline so much as methodology and subject matter. And I think that, so I moved to East Boston College, where the big diversity is between, when I got there in '86, was between the Irish Catholic kids and the Italian Catholic kids. That was diversity. And I went, oh my, So that was a kind of shock to the system after being in Chicago, and it was just such a wonderfully diverse place. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that my battle over the years meant that I had to build a theater department at a place that was basically student activities and clubs. And my goal, whatever the reason, was to build a community. And to say, instead of being who's popular, let's do it based on merit. And so as long as I was chair, and I was chair for 13 years, that existed. But as soon as I stepped down from chair, my colleagues take over, they're pushing it now into conservatory land. So you say, is there something about this that can endure? Sitting there talking about the story of Jane Addams and all that stuff, and income social workers, is very familiar. It's about professionalization and narrowing. We live in a world right now, the only time where you can get a job is if you've already done it 5 times and have 5 examples, not because you're bright and because you're expansive and can really grow and contribute something. And I think that's part of why also what you're saying in terms of the times needed. But I think in more recent years, working with kids, 20 kids undergrad, I think that because of cell phones and because of privilegedness and because of just technology in general, they don't seem to have social skills and their vision is very narrow. I find the kids the last couple of years are starting to come out of it more seem to be more open and curious and interesting. But, so I'm teaching like theater history. I like history. I know right now kind of the cool thing is to say, oh, let's do away with the canon. I don't buy it. I think the canon is useful. It doesn't have to be either or. We just have to figure out how to make it work. Because if we don't have a canon, we have no context. And then, you know, those who don't know the history are doomed to repeat it kind of thing. But then how do you teach it to these kids? So I've just been brainstorming instead of lecturing. I do some lecture format, but on the other day, we were doing, okay, medieval pageant wagons. I mean, God's sake, right, you know? And I said to the class, they said, okay, next Tuesday, I call it Thus Far Day. And I said, okay, guys, and there's about 20 in the class. I said, okay, but next Thursday, I want you guys to come up with we're going to have a pageant day, like, you know, cycle play day in our classroom. I want you guys to invent your own religion. And they looked like Dr. Hecht, what? You know? What should we, I don't know. You figure it out. You know? All I know is that you're supposed to present this thing and this thing and this thing, because that's how the pageant wagons came along. What do you want it to be? You know? And so I said, because your education should belong to you, not me. And theater history should belong to you, not me or anybody else. So I think it's the art of it. So I think it's a struggle right now to try and make things meaningful. Like, we're all sort of the same generation, roughly. And our assumptions and background understandings are of a particular kind that I'm not sure speaks to them necessarily. And it doesn't mean the subject matter can't. Right. It's just trying to find the magic key to do so. So again, hands-on, get them on their feet, do stuff, have fun. Goes back to Neva. And be a child again, because maybe that's the way, because we're so busy being serious and everything has to matter and has to be politically correct. And I think it's terrifying and squishing of them. Free their voice and their imagination.
So I think, keeping in this kind of turn, I wonder if we can pivot and think about evolving and greening kind of in a way. So let's mix it up a little bit and talk about, if we're talking about telling stories and they're not all necessarily our own, who has the right to tell what stories? When does, is there a line between being an ally and supporting someone's telling of their story? Or is there the point where somehow we've crossed into cultural appropriation and we're taking someone else's story and it's maybe losing the context or turning into something else or being used for some other purpose? I think we had some examples of this when we were speaking earlier about murals and mural work, and when does it go from being an expressive mode through which a community shares something about how they see themselves in place to a Sprite advertisement?
Cool.
And is that always bad if the Sprite advertisement provides some empowerment to do the other work, or is it terrible because it strips out the form? So maybe Willa, we'll start with you on this idea of cultural appropriation and who gets to tell whose stories, or perhaps in what spaces. What are some of the guidelines or danger points around that?
Yikes. We don't have enough time in this room. I don't have enough time in life to sort of have that. So here's what I'd say. This is my problem with the canon. The canon is a construction of knowledge. In the same way that the hunt is told by the hunter, the story of the hunt is told by the hunter, so the hunter is always the hero. The canon is constructed not so much to allow a diversity of knowledge, but to narrow and define. In the same way that professionalism has sort of narrowed and defined what art is. And so when only a few people get to make the canon, that's my problem with the canon. That it's not valuable information, but it's not the whole story, and it's not the whole information. I think part of the problem with sort of who tells a story is that, to me, indicates that there's not enough room for everybody to tell their story, and that everybody's story is not valued. And I believe that that's what I fight against. Not which story to choose, but that everybody's story is valid. And it is their responsibility to own that knowledge and own that history. And my responsibility, if you want to call it as an ally, is to make space for them to be able to tell that authentic story.
Yeah, I mean, I think even in our historiography of Hull House, you know, we talked a lot about the plays proper that people put on, but to me the much more radical thing that people were doing at Hull House is inviting people to tell their own story across difference. And that was part of the community building and the auto-historicizing and the bringing in of knowledge that then could become so integral to our theatrical practice in the city. One of the things we talked about, I'm like, the canon, what is it? You know, because one of the things I've thought about a lot, so I teach a weird configuration of things, which is I teach theater history, and I also teach hip hop and theater and community engaged practice. And one of the things that you know comes up a lot is the why we imagine the Greeks to be the origin of Western theater. But that's one question that we should ask. But the other question is, so where are the Greeks? Who are the Greeks interacting with? And actually, you see a lot of Greek theaters inspired by networks of, you know, African merchants and Asian merchants. And so I think we can always ask ourselves, sort of, even what we've canonized, where is it coming from? You know, like, how are we making our history? One of the things we talked about, so I just wrote a book called Ensemble Made Chicago with my colleague Chloe Johnston. And it starts with Hull House, actually, to look at the practices of 15 companies in Chicago who make ensemble and co-created work and devised work. That's the work our editor made us use because they said nobody knows what devised. We don't even use it in the book, but it's in the title. But because it's more legible. And you know, one of the things we were interested in is who's influencing who, and even in sort of looking at the work at Hull House, you know, with the greatest respect to Neva Boyd and Viola Spolin, was, like I said, in tears. I also think that, you know, part of what they were doing that gets forgotten also, and I don't think necessarily that they wanted to put forth this erasure, is even where some of these games and stories were coming from. We don't know who the people were. That's kind of the nature of those power dynamics. But I think we have a real responsibility as storytellers and teachers of all sorts, whether it's on the stage, in a classroom, or in our own communities, to constantly be challenging how it is that we know what we know, and wondering what would change about what we know as we include more people in the storytelling.
Or me? See you writing notes.
I agree with everything that my esteemed colleagues to the north have said. I want to put together a panel. Somebody who a lot of us know named Dwight Conker wrote a paper once called, or an article called Performance is a Moral Act. And he posits 5 sort of positions, and they're limited and partial, but positions, ethical positions, that someone might take in ethnographic research, so researching and other, in quotes, with the purpose of, and there are pitfalls, and there are 4 pitfalls, but at the center of this proposed paradigm is this thing called dialogical performance, which asks people to engage in dialogue with whoever they're engaging with. So it's a back and forth, literally. I'm learning something from you, you're learning something from me, I'm wondering about you, you're wondering about me. And I think that a dialogical, it's been called other things too, witnessing, co-performative witnessing, things like that. I think that, I think that I assign myself and I invite my students to say that this is the question that must be sort of the second question that we always ask whenever we engage material. And that is, why are we doing this? Whose material is this? Or whose story is this? Who should be telling it? What are the core truths of this story? What responsibility do we have and to whom? And And that question for me is never answered, and it changes through time, and it's an ethical approach to the project if that is one of the most important questions at all times through the project. And that's what I think my responsibility is, and again, what I invite my students to consider as their responsibility. And we have exercises that we do to embody this idea. One of them is, just very briefly, we invite students to share a moment of personal shame or a fear, very brief moment. They share it with somebody, then they create a short abstract performance, 30 seconds, and then they're invited to share. So Willa's told me her moment, I've told her mine. I'll sit in a chair in front of all of you. She'll do an abstract performance of my moment of shame. She'll sit down, I'll do hers. And then we all talk about it, and I say, what was the most important thing to you in doing this? And everybody ultimately says to get it right. To get it right. To get the core truth of Willa's story right. That's what I needed to do to be successful. And I propose that from now on, whenever you create, you create so that if that person were sitting in a chair next to you, you'd be okay with it. And that doesn't mean that if this was a political figure, if Willa were a political figure who I didn't agree with profoundly because I thought they were dangerous, if I could do that performance with her still sitting here, then that might be an ethical performance. So I think about ethics a lot, and the question of ethics, when I think about who can speak for whom, and at positions of allyship and appropriation. And it's always complex, and it's always fraught. And I have very personal and deeply felt, mistakes that I have made and my company has made. And I have very, I'm directing a play. I wrote a play right now that a white woman wrote a short story that has two Chinese Americans as the main characters. I adapted the play, and now I can't direct my own play because in 3 years' time it shifted from me being able to direct this play to now me not being able to direct this play because we need to have an Asian American direct this play, but it's okay to have a Filipina Asian American direct this play. Doesn't need to be a Chinese American. So, and I understand all of this, and I have a spirit of generosity, and I'm not angry, I'm curious. I'm curious and fascinated by how we continue to question who has the right to embody or work with other people's ways of knowing.
Well, one of the things I found very striking, Aretha, in your slides, in your presentation, was the slide where you could have the newspaper photographs of the players that were actually in performance. And so many times, again, unintentionally or not, there's an erasure of who is actually doing the work. And so even to have a record, however ephemeral or fleeting or incomplete it is, to have something in the margins to hold on to that could be questioned further, I think is an interesting place to start at some point. Mm-hmm. I want to take a pause, and we can maybe take a moment. I'm just going to take a very brief pause to reconfigure our table here just a little bit, but I know that there are no cards if you have questions, and so I'll take a pause so that we can pass those out and begin to think of questions, and then we'll continue with some more conversation, if that's okay. So we'll just take about 2 minutes. Okay, so I think this is a good place to kind of pick up a little bit, and I'm going to ask my dear colleagues for a little bit more feedback and to talk maybe a little bit more deeply about your particular companies that you work with and this notion of identity and how it's formed around particular communities, and thinking about maybe some of the work that you've done. Christine, I'm thinking very much about Still Alice, but you're not limited to only speak of that, but thinking about a community, and also just Coya, thinking about Free Street as a body, as an ensemble. What would you say? How? And I know you do it both differently in each instance, but Christina, telling the story of Still Alice, what is it that you were hoping to share about a particular identity or sets of identities for community in that environment?
Okay.
And you can kind of give them the short version of the. Yeah.
So I through life accident, I started working with people with memory loss, with Alzheimer's disease, and I started this program called the Memory Ensemble with Northwestern's Alzheimer's Disease Center, and we used improvisation. We didn't know what we were doing, somebody said, can we use, we want to create a program, can you do something with theater? And I said, maybe. What would you do? I don't know, we'll figure it out. We just started figuring out. It came out to improvisation, and now we have a curriculum. And the Memory Ensemble meets most Monday mornings from 10 to 11:30. And we work with people with memory loss to improve quality of life. But during the course of doing this, I said to people, I knew nothing about memory loss. At that time, I had nobody in my life with memory loss that I knew of. And, I said, give me things to read. Somebody gave me this book called Still Alice, which has since been made into a movie that a lot of people have seen. Anyway, I adapted the book into a play. And in the course of doing that, and then we produced it in 2013 at Looking Glass, I became just very much more aware. I woke up to disability community, aging issues, aging studies, disability studies, and then my background's performance studies. So a lot of my thinking has been at the intersections of these three areas now. And so one of the things that I, by accident, again, sort of was radical about the stage adaptation of Still Alice is not the part I'm going to tell you right now. What we did was, which is a device that we inherited. Everyone said that's brand new, but it's not new at all. We staged the narrator. We split the character of Alice and we put herself on stage at the same time. So the gift to the audience is very simple. You get a window into what somebody's thinking. Sometimes we're mad at ourselves. Sometimes we take care of ourselves. Sometimes we confuse ourselves. And we got to see this relationship and this person with memory loss go through this. What was radical is that I insisted that herself did not aid, or that progressed in the illness along with Alice. And a lot of people assumed that there would be a well-help herself inside a sick Alice. And I said, no, this is the question of the book. The book is still Alice. How are we still ourselves? Are we still ourselves till when? To the last possible moment was my proposal based on what I'd learned working with people. It's just to quickly changing self, and that's the tragedy, is that the people with memory loss are changing more quickly, and it's uncontrolled. So the big idea was that and caregivers and people came to me and said, thank you for doing this, because this counters this discourse that there's a well self inside a sick self. And I don't know if that, what? So I learned about a whole new community that I'm still engaged with and still working on.
I think sometimes identity, and I brought it up as a good example, so sometimes there are these very categorical ways that identity gets flattened out. Race, gender, ethnicity, and then it stopped. And I just thought that was a good way to think about identity in these complicated ways, and that even if it is not your own identity, there's an earnest or sincere way that you can approach knowing through identity, even though it's not your own. Right. Speaking another angle on who can tell what stories, I guess.
And this complicates it wholly, because there's a lot of discourse in communities of people who have disabilities about who could perform people with disabilities on stage. And there was, we did a lot of deep thinking about that, but of course we can't have a person with memory loss performing Alice on stage. So how do we perform the other authentically, responsibly? And is this creating a space for them to speak for themselves?
Well, yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit, and I think we kind of skirted it a little bit with kind of the origins of Free Street. I think we touched it really briefly in the beginning, but particularly its social context in Chicago, and of course now it being 69, 79, 89, some years old, how has it evolved? And I think this takes us towards legacy in some ways.
So I was not born when Free Street started, so I can't give you a first-hand account of it. I didn't even hear about Free Street until 2012, which to me is extraordinary, because actually the history of Free Street is that Free Street artists innovated much of what we take to be sort of assumed practice in a lot of community-engaged arts in Chicago. A lot of youth arts. Free Street was the first arts partner in residence with the Chicago Park District. Free Street proposed the program. Free Street was the first to partner with the Parks District to perform in public spaces regularly as a every summer practice, way before Night Out in the Parks. Free Street was one of the first theater companies going into public schools to use theater as literacy. Free Street initiated the Clown Doctors program here in Chicago, inspired by the one in New York, what is now Lori. Free Street did so much. First parent-teen, program for pregnant teens and their parents program. First program specifically focusing on working with elders. I mean, Free Street was really radical. Moved into Cabrini Green in the mid-'80s to make a musical with residents there. They put their offices in an old morgue. And we complain about our office now, but when I go to an old morgue, I now just put a smile on my face when I go to our beautiful Park District space. So, and yet all of that is largely forgotten in Chicago. We've so normalized a lot of the practices to the extent that kind of what Free Street does sometimes seems almost like, yeah. Everybody wants to include community in their work. And I'm like, well, actually, there was a time when nobody wanted to do that. That was seen as amateur hour until funders became interested in that. Free Street was interested in it before funders were. But I will say that our work is very different now than it was. I joke a lot that our early incarnation, whatever your stereotype about free street theater in the late 60s, early 70s is, I'm pretty sure Free Street was that. Lots of afros and flowing hair and leotards and singing and dancing about are we a flock of sheep, or just these songs about brotherhood and togetherness and parks and holding hands, but with the audience invited to participate from the beginning. Now, we don't wear matching leotards, and we actually are not an ensemble anymore. So for a long time, Free Street was an ensemble of professional artists interested in doing kind of outdoor and outreach theater. We're not that anymore. All of our work is co-created and ensemble-based. We do 6 to 8 projects a year. But what I'm interested in under my tenure as artistic director, I've been there for 6 years, is how do we use theater to address gaps? We know that Chicago is the most segregated city in the country by every measure of segregation. Theater is particularly segregated. A University of Chicago study that came out a few years ago showed that 78% of everyone who made any money at all in Chicago theater, not pay or rent money, any money at all, is white. In a city where that white people constitute much less than a half of the population, we can start to understand that when we talk about racial inequity in Chicago theater, we're talking about something that's really deeply ingrained. The numbers are not close to 50-50. They're so far away. Most theaters in Chicago, we know this, concentrate on the northeast side of the city, where the wealthiest and whitest people in the city live. I mean, even, Willa and I talk about this a lot. I love so much the work that the Goodman does. But we have this imagination in Chicago that the Goodman and the Loop are in the center of the city. But when you look at a map of Chicago theater, the Goodman is nowhere near the center of the city. And actually, there are almost no theaters on the south and west sides of the city, formal theater spaces. There's 3, maybe 4. That doesn't mean there isn't theater and there isn't a performance. But, so what we try to do at Free Street is think, where are the gaps? And how can we work in collaboration with communities to fill those gaps? We travel all over the city. We also have, think about our work a lot as a solidarity project. We're picking issues that impact Chicagoans broadly and trying to bring together a wide range of Chicagoans to talk about that issue. We do that with people of all ages. We have an awesome ensemble of young people 13 to 19 who will be performing for you soon. So much excited. And we also have, just recently, last year, we opened a second space, so we're housed in the Pulaski Park building. As I mentioned, we're the first arts partner. We've been there for over 30 years. We opened something called the Storyfront, where we moved into an unused refrigerator repair shop and turned it into a tiny theater in back of the yards at 43rd and Ashland. Because we couldn't find a theater. We were working on a play about working class Mexicans in Chicago, and we just couldn't find a theater in a working class Mexican neighborhood in Chicago on the south side. It was specifically about side-siders. Hilton has a lot of theaters, but they're not run by Mexicans anymore because of gentrification. And so we decided we needed to build our own space. So we're in our second year of running a space there where community members are invited to drop by anytime. We do free programming every night. We have a free concert there tonight. We do plays, we do improv shows, teach workshops, have a youth program. That's a really kind of specific and new effort to think about disparity and how we address it. So we do a lot of different work. It's quite different than it was in 1969. I would hope so. But we still hold that kind of founding impulse. Like, how can we use theater to bring people together across racial and economic difference?
Maybe this is a good to think for some historical context, maybe Stuart and maybe Aretha. So a question here in thinking about the neighborhood changes as a result of the Immigration Act, particularly in 1924. The question is that there's been significant representation of early Hull House theater players, particularly those of European descent. Was there any documented involvement or significant involvement of African American or Latinx or other ethnic communities, Asian American communities in Hull House?
That's one reason why near the end of my talk I led up to this particular play, Halsted Street, and I didn't, because I tackled way too much. Didn't get a chance to say about it. The whole point of Halsted Street I loved was that after, I don't know what, Halsted starts 1889, so we're talking about like 50 years of Hull House, where it's basically top down in terms of the arts. Every year they would do a cantata where all the different arts got together, but it was still top down. But the reason Halsted Street is so cool is because Justy Ogden and the theater arts community, which included Viola Spolin, worked as a committee to put together something with the community. And the whole premise was, there's a trolley car that's going up Halsted Street, past all the slums and past all the different neighborhoods. Let's pause and see what's going on at this stop. And in the process, here we are in the middle of the Mexican community. Let's see what's going on in the Mexican community. And people from the Mexican community were performing on stage. Now let's go to the African American community. And it was really a shift because it was grassroots, it was inclusive, it was reflective of the changes in the community and what was available to them at that point in time, which was Greek, Italian, African American, and Mexican. And white insofar as the leadership of Hull House still. But I saw that as just a huge shift and really pointing toward the present and where we are now, anticipating it by how many years now. And the Hull Institute itself is open to this, and again, in the name of saying that art and creativity and individual expression, is all one and parcel of this thing, and improving the world, they're all part of the same impulse. And it's almost kind of sad, like I said, that then Hull House got a little too pushy, and then all these people ended up being quitting, because it was like right when it was actually could have, should have, maybe would have.
The example that I know of is Halsted Street. I really don't. This area of history is not something I can speak to too much, but I was excited to hear you describe it, because the way I know of Halsted Street is from a review that was in Viola's papers, where the guy, it was in one of the major papers, and he said, no one will ever hear of this production, but for me it's worth 100 Broadway openings or something like that. And he lists all the different ethnic groups that were in it, right? And he said there's over 100 performers or something like that. It was a huge thing. So I think there's some more historical work to be done, and finding out who was about some of these productions. But it was cool to hear it described as what the show actually was, because he was so enthused by what it was that the reviewer wasn't really describing the production itself. But it does sound pretty cool.
Just to add to it, because most of all, do you mind with that? Just real quick. But it was something like 300 different performers.
300.
Yeah, and they were seated in the audience. So it's like when their scene came up, then they would leave the audience, or they'd stand up in their seats. Very 1930s
Yeah.
agit-prop kind of stuff, you know? But it was really a sense of community. And they also had some reviews in there. They were interviewing the people who were performing. And they're like, we're so worried about our world. We're so worried about our conditions. And here's a chance to express it.
Do we have a script? Is the script extant?
I have the, what happened was that Jesse Ogden, this is the second show he did like this, but he wrote like, it's like reading the Iliad or something. It's all like, I'm not saying pentameter, but it's choral, you know, almost like that.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like pages and pages, and we will not be this, very 30s, you know. But what is missing is exactly what was then done on the stops. Like, for example, when they got to the African American community, apparently, we can hear the sound of spirituals being sung. But you don't hear that, or were there scenes attached to it? We don't know. So we have his governing narrative, but what each group did within. And I think that's what Viola was doing. I think that she was doing some of the skit work, right? The work on the skits.
I really don't know.
No, I think it was.
I
From
believe
what
you.
I've learned from,
I believe
where she actually is saying, and working with locals to use an improv to find stuff.
Where is it?
Yeah.
What's archives?
Yeah.
Coming soon to Full
I
House.
have to dig into her letters and see if she wrote about that.
Oh, please.
I wonder, there's a couple questions here that I want to share so that we have a chance to respond. And then with the time left, just open up any ones that aren't answered. So a couple are related to pedagogy, and actually two of them are related to embodiment in a certain way. So one question is, following on the topic of who can speak for another, do you feel that the role of embodiment in theater causes more or fewer complications or issues? And I guess I'm interpreting this in a way of the liveness of it, the presence and liveness of theater.
I think that real life is messier than ideas. I think that when you have real people up there with their quirks and the way they look and the way they act and the way they react off each other and is so complex. And when you want to theorize, it's like you want to simplify. But life is not simple. And I think that it does complicate it, but maybe it also enriches it with the understanding or assumption, perhaps, that I guess one of the cool things about theater is that if someone else was now doing it, I mean, in conventional terms, this person's playing Hamlet, now this person's playing Hamlet. The fact that there's different people doing it show that there's different ways to interact and think and be.
Well, I wonder, and I'm thinking, Christine, of the answer you gave in thinking about the memory project in particular, and this whole teasing apart then representation and being willing to grapple with how you're representing something, not literally. So you're not saying, okay, we need a person with memory loss and an Asian character and two people with this, but not kind of playing and having to grapple with the abstract nature of representation in a body, but not trying to do mimicry or not mimesis. So I'm wondering if, I think you started to answer that for me, this way of recognizing that it is complicated in the same way that it's now complicated to direct certain kinds of stories from a point of view that's not your own, even though the goal is not necessarily to only be able to speak from your own point of view.
So my short answer to the question is yes, it's more complicated and it should be. And it's good. And I think we have to be complicated. I think, I was talking to somebody who, I think we have an impulse towards simplification. And things aren't simple. And they're complex. And so I think there's more at stake when there are bodies up there. And I think it's more complicated when there are bodies up there. And when we're embodying ourselves, or it feels we have more authority generally. and we are the experts, so it is maybe less complicated. It's complicated in different ways than if we're performing somebody else. But one of the questions that I ask students is, if should we, and this is meant to be provocative, but should we only perform autoethnography? And if the answer is we should perform more than our own, very own stories, then what kind of guidelines do we consider when we consider performing any story other than our own, and then who can embody or write? And I think writing's a different mode of, it's not literally embodying, but speaking for. So I think it's complicated, and I think it should be. And I think it's exciting that it's complicated and dangerous.
This is where I think it is both easier and harder. I mean, to some extent, we know that everything that happens in theater is not real. So we suspend belief. We're willing to believe that this person is X character. At the same time, I teach directing as well, and I tell my students, the most important decision you'll make about your play is your casting, because who you cast into the part is going to change everything about how this play looks and sounds. And if you make the wrong decision, you'll have the wrong play. Or sometimes you will have a beautiful new play that you didn't mean to have. One of the reasons that I love ensemble practice, though, is that when we are all playing multiple roles all of the time and kind of switching character, it becomes a much more, the sort of switching between positionalities becomes much more acceptable because we're all doing that. When it comes to casting just one role, to me, I always just go back to questions of equity. That it seems so deeply unjust that given such a limited professional representational field, if you're an actor of color, for example, that you'd be denied the opportunity to play a character or direct a show, for example, that is more closely aligned with the stories that feel like yours, if that makes sense. So for ensemble, I always think it's kind of a free-for-all because we're always just switching and playing, and hopefully we're doing that respectfully. It's not that it doesn't have weight, but I take much more seriously the act of casting people into single roles.
So early looking glass, we were all on ensemble, we were all white, and we were doing like the Odyssey and this and that, and then we did the Arabian Nights. Which of course, now we're like, ah! And and it's been written up and it's a problem. And
it's like an official problem.
It's an official problem. It's in the headlines as a problem. And it's, it's endlessly fascinating to me. And we were, Mary Zimmerman, who was also a problem officially for a lot of people, she said it was because of the war. And she was angry about how we were demonizing and otherizing people from the Middle East. And so her answer to that was to make a piece that humanized the Middle East. And the way she did that was she put it in the vibe. This is, partial and flawed. But, and then for our audiences, you gotta realize back then it was the same audience every time. So they came back and they saw us do this, and then this, and then this, and they saw the same dress go from play to play to play to play. So they were experiencing this and reading it in a very different way, a very situated way. And of course, not all the audience was new, but, repeat, thank you. But most of it was. And then we took it to Los Angeles, and then we had people ululating in burqas in the front row, and one woman said, "Thank you for telling our story." And I know this is fraught, and she said, "Thank you for telling our story, and thank you for telling." There's one story in it called "The Enormous Fart," and it's literally this man who's got gas at his own wedding, and he's embarrassed, and it's the saga of how he deals with having a fart. And somebody said that was the most radical gesture in the piece, and because it humanized people from the Middle East. So, these things are so richly complicated. Go.
Well, I remember talking to Mary about this piece, and I asked her if she thought it was Orientalist, and she was like, "Of course it is. I love it." I was like, wow, that's not even a critique for her. It's just like, yes, I'm celebrating. But I think like a lot of different things, so I enter into that in a couple of different thoughts. Is like, one, I'm not sure that, I think there's a fine line between trying to like humanize another story by telling it, and I'm speaking generally as I did not see this original performance, and maybe still investing in a fantasia that is part of what allows us to continue to be at war with a quote unquote other. That we've had this like hundreds of years of history with Asia and the Middle East of, not quite, it's love-hate, but it's never actually human and complicated. The fart probably is the most radical moment of like, people have gas. The gas we pass. If anyone has children, you're probably familiar with that word book. The other thing I think though is like sometimes, we made a passing reference to West Side Story that I worked on a long time ago. One of the things that's always fascinated me about West Side Story is like a love-hate relationship that so many Latinx people I know have with that play, particularly of a certain generation, because it was actually one of the only representations of Puerto Ricans or Latinos, Latinx people at its time, and yet not actually played by any. And so I was obsessed with that movie as a child, both loving it and feeling deeply uncomfortable with it. I mean, there are moments where you can see the brown face rub off in a fight scene on someone else, and I guess they didn't have the budget or the time to edit that or reshoot it. It's such a deeply complicated thing, and I think sometimes, especially in earlier economies, representational economies where we spent less time thinking about who should tell what story, that's a relatively new debate. We would just be so grateful for any acknowledgement that we exist. But I think we're past that time. And we also have to understand that theater is not just representation for an audience, it's work for actors, it's work for directors, it's work for designers. And those of us from marginalized communities also have a right to work and not just be talked about. And so it's also complicated though.
So can I give a plug for UIC?
Yes.
So we started
we're gonna fight some more.
Oh, you want to fight?
Yeah, okay. Christine and I were in the same graduate cohort, so we have lots of experience having loving arguments.
I agree with everything you said. But so I've been doing this for 35 years. I've never had an African American stage manager. There always a person who's African American works with our company. I've never had a person from the Hispanic community or the Latin community as a technical director. And at UIC, we serve people from across the city primarily in our theater and performance, in our School of Theater and Music. And we're focusing on our sign production and technology program. When I got here, that's one of the first groups of faculty we started to hire. And I said, we can be the place where people can get an affordable education. We're majority minority students, and we're diverse in every way, to be the school that can be the place where people, the community in the city and across the nation can start to have a pipeline for people who want to be designers and technicians and stage managers who haven't come from non-white backgrounds, who didn't come from a place where they could go take a, get a theater degree.
I do think that I make my admissions program at the theater school a little bit nuts, I think, because I'm very reluctant. So at Free Street, we work with a lot of young people, not exclusively, but I'm very reluctant to recommend the theater school to the students at Free Street. I'd much rather refer them to UIC because I think it does have a more diverse approach, both in terms of who is coming in as students, but also even the way you're teaching, and the kind of way you think about what theater is. You know, that the theater school, like, we're on camera, I won't discuss the demographics of my job, it's not diverse, it is zero diverse.
Well, and I can speak from our mothership institution too. One of the initiatives that I'm responsible for in my role is making sure that as many other efforts are in place to make sure that there's a certain amount of diversity in our undergraduate programs, in particular, that students who then come in, many of which who are now also coming from economically diverse backgrounds that resonate. So low-income, first-generation, underrepresented minorities, which are not necessarily all of the same one person, but different communities as well, have equal opportunity and access to out-of-classroom learning opportunities. And if you're thinking about practice-based learning opportunities, people who don't come from backgrounds that already have social capital do not know how to network, or those aren't their networks. And so I'm thinking that this is a time where there's a lot of intentional mindfulness in many spaces to think about the importance of theater and embodiment, the importance of representation, not just as symbolic, but as power and as voice and as efficacy and advocacy. And so I think this is an exciting time to have these conversations, reflecting upon these longer histories and how they've moved us to this point, and then also how we can mine these tools that were good 100 years ago, and still we can follow forward in some ways as we move forward. So I think we'll end right here. I want to think, we'll end our piece. If there are other questions, we do have a little more time.
I've got a story I gotta tell. I've been wanting to listen. And it has to do with the character that Stuart brought up. And I want you to imagine hanging over here the ghost of George Bernard Shaw. Because we're very proud that this is one of the first places that it's produced. But Shaw believed absolutely fiercely that only socialists should be allowed to perform his plays. Because A, they would believe and understand and it would be authentic, and it would give work to actors and stage people who otherwise sometimes had political prejudice against them. And in UK, he could control it. And in America, he had no control because copyright and intellectual property law were different. And so the plays that were performed here were usually not with his consent.
Can I comment on that? Yeah, he did say that, but it didn't stop Mrs. Patrick Campbell from playing his roles.
Indeed. No, I mean,
And they had a lifelong correspondence.
Oh, I know. I mean,
I'm just saying the contradictions between
it is complicated.
proclamations and the practical realities of professional life and so on.
Well, this is that. I mean, yes, this is exactly what it's all. I mean, once he got very rich, he sometimes thought differently, but his companies were, you know, he and Mae Morris and Sparling and I can't remember who else, they all had to be socialists. And when their non-socialist friends wanted to come and join their ensembles, the answer was no. So there's a real appropriation going on that we perform George Bernard Shaw plays, which he thought were supposed to be the faithful.
Are there any?
So I'd like to make a comment following up on the Halsted Street. My dissertation, which led to a book, was on the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. So this is early 1930s. In order to get community buy-in for nationalities around the city and all their pocket neighborhoods to participate, they held a huge pageant at the Auditorium Theater, and they asked each ethnic community to send people in costume. And then they had a written pageant. I couldn't find a script, but I have a program. So they all went across the stage telling the story of Chicago with all these ethnic communities. Curiously, and then they photographed the groups and made a little book. Curiously, the African Americans who came and participated came in street clothes. They were the only ones who didn't wear costumes. I just thought it was an interesting way, and it's very possible someone from Hull House was involved in that at the time, and now going to go back and start looking at things. But I thought it's interesting because this would have been a couple of years before the production of Halsted Street.
I'm just curious, was Thomas Wood Stevens involved in that?
I would have to go back and relook at the names. I did this research a long time ago, but I still have all my files, so I'll figure it out.
Any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank our panelists, Aretha, Stuart, Christine, Coya, and Willa, who left a little earlier. Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you during this time, and I encourage you to take a quick break and stay for the Free Street Theater. And fill out your evaluations. And the performance begins at 4:30.
We might begin a little earlier.
So, thank you.
Thank you.